We are wrapping up our Advent series this morning. For those of you who haven't been here, you don't know, Advent is the 4-week season leading up to Christmas. The word Advent means coming or the coming of God. So Advent is a season of waiting. We've been looking at passages from the Hebrew prophet Isaiah, so we named the series Waiting with Isaiah. Isaiah lived in the 8th century BC in the land of Israel, specifically in a territory named Judah. And like us, his was a little more extreme than ours, but he experienced a world of war, injustice, despair, oppression. That was his reality. And so, understandably, he longed for a different world, right? He wanted a world that wasn't marked by war, but it was marked by peace. One that wasn't characterized by injustice, but justice. He wanted a world that wasn't characterized by despair, it was characterized by joy. And one that wasn't characterized by oppression, but deliverance. And I would hope that we would join him in that. Right? That as we look out in our world and where we see war and injustice and despair and oppression, that our hearts would go, man, I want this world to be different. And so he was waiting. He was waiting for God to sort of break in to the world and affect change. And we're waiting with him in that same way. So we spent the first 3 weeks of the series talking about his vision for peace and justice and joy. This morning, we're going to talk about that fourth piece, deliverance. We're waiting with Isaiah for deliverance. The passage we're going to look at is in Isaiah chapter 7. Many of you may be familiar with this, some not. It'll be up on your screens, or if you got a Bible, you can follow along. This is Isaiah chapter 7, starting in verse 10. Later, the Lord sent this message to King Ahaz. Ask the Lord your God for a sign of confirmation, Ahaz. Make it as difficult as you want, as high as heaven or as deep as the place of the dead. But the king refused. No, he said, I will not test the Lord like that. Then Isaiah said, listen well, you royal family of David. Isn't it enough to exhaust human patience? Must you exhaust the patience of my God as well? All right then, the Lord himself will give you the sign. Look, the virgin will conceive a child. She will give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. By the time this child is old enough to choose what is right and reject what is wrong, he'll be eating yogurt and honey. For before the child is that old, the lands of the two kings you fear so much will both be deserted. So the prophet Isaiah comes to a man named Ahaz. Ahaz is the king of Judah at the time, and says, Ahaz, I want you to ask for a sign of confirmation. Well, a sign of confirmation for what? Well, the story that you're stepping into is at the time, Ahaz is the king of the territory of Judah. I'll show you this map. Ahaz is the king of Judah, which is right here, and he has just gotten word that the kingdom of Israel and Aram have allied up, and they've started to attack his territory. So they're basically attacking his northernmost cities here in the border between Israel and Judah, and the obvious intent is that they're going to move south and they're going to overrun the capital city of Jerusalem and take over the whole territory. So that's the message that Ahaz gets. You're under attack. Israel and Aram have allied up against you, and they're coming for you. And Isaiah shows up and says, basically, don't worry. God's going to deliver you. Go ahead. You can ask for a sign to confirm it, but that's what's going to happen. So on one level, Ahaz has a problem. There's a sort of immediate threatening problem. There's a couple of foreign nations that have allied up, and they're invading his territory. Okay? What you may not know is that the chronicler, the person who wrote the book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the way that person interprets this invasion is that it's punishment against Ahaz because Ahaz was an unfaithful king. So it's like you read, that little section in Isaiah 7 where Isaiah says, go ahead and ask for a sign. And Ahaz is like, no. I don't want to test the Lord like that. It makes it sound like Ahaz was like this good, faithful dude. That was not the case, okay? This is the description you get of Ahaz in 2 Kings in chapter 16. It says, he did not do what was pleasing in the sight of the Lord his God as his ancestor David had done. Every king, the description starts like this. You either did what was pleasing or you didn't do what was pleasing. That's the first sentence in every description of every king. They either did or they didn't. So Ahaz falls into the category of all the kings who didn't do what was pleasing to the Lord. It goes on to say, instead, he followed the example of the kings of Israel, even sacrificing his own son in the fire. In this way, he followed the detestable practices of the pagan nations the Lord had driven from the land ahead of the Israelites. He offered sacrifices and burned incenses at the pagan shrines and on the hills and under every green tree. So Ahaz is not a good king. This is not a good dude. He is not following the God of Israel, Yahweh. In fact, he's picked up practices from neighboring nations. If you read the Old Testament, there's a few ways that Old Testament writers distinguish the God of Israel from all of the other gods. All the nations have gods, right? One of the ways that they distinguish is they say Yahweh actually exists and the other gods don't. I mean, that's one way, and you'll see that sort of over and over again. But another way that Yahweh gets distinguished, Israel's God gets distinguished from all of the other so-called gods, is that the God of Israel does not ever demand child sacrifice. So the Hebrew prophets over and over and over again, this is a mark of distinction, that if you are sacrificing your children, you are worshiping some other God, not the God of Israel. So Ahaz has drifted away, if he ever was, has drifted away from any sort of understanding of who God actually is and what God actually desires and what it looks like to know this God and to be faithful to this God. So on one level, Ahaz has the problem of these foreign armies invading his territory, but he also has this problem of not knowing God, not being faithful to God. The question is, which is the more serious problem? Which is the thing that Ahaz most needs to be delivered from? The immediate threat of Israel and Aram, coming over the ridge, or this problem of not knowing God enough to trust God and do what God says? Which is the bigger threat? Now, the chronicler has got his opinion. He says that the one problem, Israel and Aram, the threat of foreign invasion, was caused by Ahaz's unfaithfulness, making it, by definition, the bigger issue, right? So, I recently had my appendix out. The inflamed appendix was the root cause of the pain that I was experiencing. By definition, it was the bigger problem. The hospital did some things to help deal with the pain, but it wasn't until they actually went in and took out the problemed organ that solved the issue, right? So there are causes, there are effects. What the chronicler says is that Ahaz's unfaithfulness is the root cause, the root problem that is leading to the consequential problems of Israel and Aram attacking him. Ahaz does not see it that way. So when Isaiah comes to him and says, yeah, I know, you're being attacked, I know, it's scary, but don't worry, God is going to rescue you. God's going to deliver you. In this moment, you see both of Ahaz's problems converging, right, in a single decision. You've got the issue with the foreign invaders, and you've got the issue of his willingness or unwillingness to trust God. And they're converging in one moment. He can deal with his primary problem, the root problem, by just trusting Isaiah and taking him at his word. But that is not what Ahaz does. What Ahaz does is he goes on to basically take matters into his own hands. So he hears what Isaiah is saying. Okay, God's going to deliver you, God's going to take care of it. But how exactly is that going to happen? I mean, how is God just going to magically make these armies go away? So I know what I need to do. I need to take matters into my own hands. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send emissaries to the baddest military superpower in the region, right? The Assyrian Empire. I mean, these are the guys with the biggest guns. So he sends emissaries to Assyria, and he says, hey, will you come and help me and take care of my problem with Israel and Aram? That's what he does. And what I want you to see is that it makes both of his problems worse. When he takes matters into his own hands and chooses to deal with the consequential problems and not address the causal problem, it makes both problems worse. He obviously doesn't get any closer to learning how to trust God, but his consequential problems get worse. Many of you are probably familiar with the imagery in Isaiah 7, the imagery of a baby. So basically what Isaiah says is, okay, look, here's what's going to happen. God's going to rescue you from this threat. Oh, you don't want to ask for a sign? You want to act like you're all pious? We all know you worship foreign gods, but okay, fine. Then I'll just give you one. Here's the sign. A woman is going to have a baby, and by the time that baby's old enough to eat yogurt, Israel and Aram are going to be gone. Okay? Now the baby, we all, good church folk, we hear baby and Emmanuel, God with us, and we go, Jesus, 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 that's Jesus, right? We just jump right to Jesus. What you realize in Isaiah 7 is the baby doesn't, Isaiah doesn't know Jesus. In Isaiah's mind, the baby actually represents Assyria. So the baby actually has two names. The first name is Emmanuel, God with us. But you read like 20 verses later, and you discover that the baby is actually Isaiah's. That the woman in question is Isaiah's wife. She's going to have a child, and they name the child Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz. That name means swift to plunder or quick to carry away. So you got one baby that represents deliverance, but on a couple of levels. So if you're Ahaz, you think Assyria is God with us. This is God's way of rescuing me. Assyria is God's sent deliverer, right? Or what Isaiah is trying to tell Ahaz is if you do that, if you take matters into your own hands and you go conscript the help of Assyria, what you don't realize is that Assyria is swift to plunder. They are quick to carry away. So what's going to happen is, they're going to come solve the problem you think you have, and then they're going to become a bigger problem, right? Meet the new boss, worse than the old boss. Assyria shows up. They take care of Israel and Aram, but you don't think that kind of foreign aid comes with no strings attached, do you? Assyria shows up and takes care of the foreign invaders, and then they basically become Judah's new oppressor. But they're bigger, they're stronger, and it becomes a huge issue for Judah. So in this one moment, King Ahaz he's got two problems. He's got the fundamental problem, the causal problem of not knowing God. And by knowing, I don't mean believing that God exists. I mean developing a certain level of intimacy with and trust in and dependence on knowing God. That's a causal problem. And it's leading to these consequential problems that feel very threatening, very immediate. But instead of attending to the causal problem, he just does something to deal with being delivered from the consequence. Of course, he doesn't see it that way. And it makes everything worse for him and for Judah. Now, you and I live in a world that, by and large, operates this way. We do not live in a world where it is common for people to sit around and talk about root, causal, foundational questions related to God. It's not common in our world for people, in whatever the setting, to think to themselves, this may have something to do with whether or not God exists and how that redefines what it means to be human. I mean, we just don't go there. And in most settings, it's offensive to go there. I mean, to borrow language I used from a couple weeks ago, it's not common in our world for people to ask questions like, what is the story that we are a part of? That's just not common. And as a result, because we don't want to deal with sort of causal questions, fundamental, foundational questions. Does God exist? Yes or no? If yes, what is this God like? And if God exists, what does it mean to be human? How should we live? We just don't ask questions like that. So we busy ourselves in our world dealing with what are ultimately consequential problems and issues. But we don't know to call that because they feel fundamental. They feel immediate and threatening to us. And as a result, like everything gets worse. We're getting further and further away from any sort of common or shared definition of what it means to be human that has anything to do with God. That's not getting any better. And because we don't either want to address that or we don't know how to address that, our consequential problems also get worse. When all you can do is deal with symptoms, but you don't have an adequate understanding of what sort of the root cause is, you have no way of knowing if your intervention is going to help or make things worse. We see this all the time. If all we can do to address a particular problem in society is pass a law, what happens? We pass the law creates 5 additional issues that we now have to pass laws to address, which create 5 more issues, right? And we just on and on and on it goes. We may not have a choice, it's the only thing we can do, but you can see how it sort of spirals. You know, in a humorous, sort of comical example, you watch TV, you see like a drug commercial, like drug manufacturers. You know, they've created some new, drug that can help you with your insomnia, and then right at the end of the commercial, they go, now side effects. Side effects include nausea, vomiting, headaches, skin rash, blindness, right? In rare cases, you might die, but it can also help you sleep better, right? It's sort of an example of like, we obviously do not understand the root cause of something. So what we're doing is we're trying to deal with a symptom that is a problem. It is a real problem, right? Insomnia is a problem. We're going to deal with the sort of consequential problem, but without a real serious, adequate understanding of what causes it, we create 10 more problems. That's just the world that we live in, at least the world I'm living in. And because it's the world I'm living in and it's the world you're living in, I think you're tempted to live this way too. I'm tempted to live this way. Implicitly tempted. I'm sometimes explicitly pressured to live this way. To act as if my biggest problems, my most serious and most threatening problems, are the things that feel most serious, most threatening. The things that I can see, and the things that I perceive if I just roll up my sleeves and do the work, I can solve. Now listen, here's the thing. I'm not saying that that's not sometimes the case. Israel and Aram, that's a real threat. I mean, if you put yourself in Ahaz's shoes for a minute, even if he recognized his issue with God as a problem, even if he recognized it as a root problem, I got to do something in this moment. What am I going to do in this moment? If I don't attend to these enemies coming over the hill, we're all going to die. If I don't attend to my intimacy with God, look, it might have problems down the road, but it's not going to have an immediate problem right now. So I'll just sort of put that off for now. We'll deal with this one, right? And sometimes that's important. I think a real tension in this story, and you guys have probably found yourself in this place. You're at a crossroads, something's going on, you're dealing with something in your life, and you're asking yourself the question, okay, what does it mean to be faithful in this moment? The Ahaz story makes it super easy. Life doesn't work this way. In the Ahaz story, it's simple. For him, it's you do nothing. Right? Your primary problem is that you don't trust God. Isaiah just told you God's going to rescue you, so you just be patient, fold your hands, and do nothing. For him, it's super easy. It doesn't always work that way. There are times where you and I both know that you are dealing with a serious, threatening, immediate problem that requires you to take some action. You got to do something. Right? Maybe you've got an addiction issue, right? It is immediate, it is every day, it's threatening your life, it's hurting people. God's not just going to show up and fix that while you sit and do nothing different. You're going to actually have to take a faithful step of some kind. You're having problems in your marriage. You're going to have to do something. You're going to have to take a faithful step. So I think it's important to name that tension because it makes it sound like, well, it's either one or the other, right? You either do something or you don't, and we just kind of magically trust God's going to fix everything with us not having to change anything. I think the pressure point here, the place to sort of put your finger, is when you're dealing with an issue in your life, and we all have them, right? You have character problems, you have financial problems, you've got relational problems, you've got material problems, right? You've got, emotional or psychological problems. We've all got problems. And all of those problems have a root cause that has to do with God, how you think about God, who God is, what God does, your relationship to God, your willingness to trust and depend on God for your life and for your identity and for your security and your purpose and all of that. I don't want to create a false sort of dichotomy where it's you either do one or you do the other. I think the pressure point is you cannot attend to consequential problems exclusive of the primary root issues that are in God. You may have to take faithful action to deal with some immediate issue in your life, but you can't do that without also dealing with the root issues that have to deal with God. If you do, and we're tempted to do this, we're tempted to believe, and we wouldn't say it out loud, but functionally, a lot of Christian people are functional atheists. We look out at our world and we look at the problems we have, and we think that we can solve all of those problems if we just roll up our sleeves and do the work, whatever the work happens to be. So even though we would say we believe in God, we don't actually behave as if our belief in God, our trust in God, our knowledge of God, our relationship with God has anything to do with the actual problems that we're dealing with. So one of the things I'm trying to communicate here is that ultimately what you and I need to be delivered from, what Ahaz needs to be delivered from, what we've seen over and over again in the people of Judah, is their knowledge of God. Is knowing who God is. It's cultivating a relationship with God where your actual daily existence, your sense of identity, your emotional well-being, your sense of security, your understanding of what life is and how it works, what you perceive you need and don't need from other people, how you operate in the world, what you value, all of those things are rooted in your understanding of God and your relationship with God. So if you spend all of your time up here trying to deal with all of these things that feel immediate and threatening, and you never take a serious moment to sit and deal with down here, who do I actually think God is? And what am I doing in my life to cultivate any sort of intimacy with or trust or dependence on God? Both arenas are going to get worse, not better. Because our primary problem isn't the consequence of not knowing God. It's not knowing God. That's the primary problem. Biblical authors call it sin. See, we think sin is behavioral. You've probably heard people talk about sin as missing the mark, right? So that the model we give is it's a target, and it's a behavioral target. So there's a center, and you and I are supposed to hit the center every time. You were designed that way. You're supposed to always behave the right way, hit the center, right? But we don't hit the center, obviously, some of us more than others. We don't hit the center, right? And so we call that missing the mark. It's sin. God has a standard, a behavioral standard. You continuously fail to hit it, you're missing the mark. But sin, it is behavioral, but it doesn't start that way. All behavior has an upstream cause. There's something fueling it. And even in our biblical narrative, it isn't like Adam and Eve just all of a sudden are willfully disobedient. There's a mind game going on there. There's deceit about God that's happening that fuels the way that we live. Right? In the biblical narrative, how we think about God is called idolatry if it's false. And it's always connected to then how we live, what biblical authors call injustice. Idolatry and justice, they all go hand in hand, right? Sometimes I talk about this as believing lies and living lies. If you believe wrongly about God, right, and that's not just a mental game. That's knowing who God is, living with God, how you understand what life with God is all about. You screw this up, you miss the mark here, and you are definitely going to miss the mark down here because one causes the other. Our biggest problem is not the consequence, it's the thing itself. It's that we struggle with a knowing God root problem. So it's important that when the angel comes to Joseph and predicts the birth of Jesus, right? Jesus is going to be Emmanuel. God is with us. But the name Jesus means God saves. And the angel says because he's going to save his people from their sin. From their sins. Not the consequence of their sins, but the sin itself. So, like in my opinion, Jesus does not come to sort of magically take away the consequence of our sin. A lot of us, that's the story we've been told. That God comes in the person of Jesus to deal with the sin itself, the primary root problem of knowing God. Because when you deal with that, then in this sort of cascading effect, everything else ultimately gets dealt with. When you begin to see God properly, when you begin to cultivate actual trust and dependence on and intimacy with God through Christ, you start to live differently. You start to see yourself differently. You start to see other people differently, which changes the way that you relate to people. You start to value different things, which changes how you operate, where you go, where you don't go, what you do, what you don't do, what you care about, what you buy, what you don't buy, right? What you do with your stuff, how much stuff you need, where you choose to live, who you choose to associate with. All of it changes, right? When you get a clear vision of who God is in Christ and you start attending to that root issue, all of the downstream consequences change, all of them. Our primary problem is not consequence, it's root cause. It's not the result of sin, it's sin itself. It's not knowing God. And that's why it's so important. Advent is a season of waiting. Because if the primary problem, if the thing that you and I most need to be delivered from is our not knowing God, that is not a problem that you can fix. That's not something that you can attend to just by rolling up your sleeves and doing the work. That's something God has to address. God has to break into the human experience and alter our consciousness, reveal God's self in some way that changes the way that we see him, changes the way that we see ourselves and others. It's something that God has to do. And so Isaiah waits for that. And as Advent comes to a close, that's what we wait for. At Christmas, we believe that God finally shows up, that God finally breaks into the human experience to deal not with the consequence of sin, but with its root, sin itself. This issue of not knowing God and all of the problems that creates. I want you to think about in your own life, how much time and energy do you spend reactively dealing with problems in your life, but not proactively attending to God and your relationship with God? Most of us spend very little time, if any, upstream, actually attending proactively to the root issue of who we believe God to be and what it means to live faithfully with God. We spend most of our lives down here, reacting to what we perceive to be these immediate and threatening problems. Over time, things don't get better when you do that. They get worse. God has come in the person of Jesus Christ to reveal God's self to us. So a question for you to wrestle with and think through is right now, what is a problem or what are the problems in your life that you're trying to solve without attending to this root causal issue of who you believe God to be and your intimacy with, dependence on, trust in, right? Cultivating this faithfulness to God. This is what we most need to be delivered from.